Hello, and welcome to Read the Bull, the only podcast dedicated to finance and investing books. I'm your host, Stefan Prelog, and today I'm thrilled to have with me Gary Weiss, author of the book Retail Gangster, The Insane Real Life of Crazy Eddie, which was published in August this year by Hachette Books. Welcome, Gary.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Stefan.
Well, thanks for being here. I love the book.
That's wonderful.
Good, yeah. No, for anyone who grew up in the 70s and 80s in the Northeast, you knew Crazy Eddie, particularly because of the ads, but also because, they were probably one of the biggest discount electronics retailers, in the Northeast. And anyway, it's a great story. So we're going to cover the book, but before we dive into the story, I want to talk a little bit about your career as a journalist focusing on corporate fraud and greed. So you started your career at Barron's in 1984, and then you went on to Business Week, where you wrote from 86 to 2004, and you've written profiles of George Soros and Edmund Safra, but your career is littered with amazing exclusives about uncovering corporate and financial chicanery. So I just want to detail a few of those things you've covered over the years. Trading improprieties at Charles Schwab in 1991. You wrote the first stories revealing Salomon Brothers' manipulation of the government bond market. And then in 1996, December 96, you uncovered the mob's infiltration of Wall Street, which led to your first book, Born to Steal, When the Mafia Hit Wall Street, which was published in 2003. And I know you've written 3 more books since then. The latest, of course, was Retail Gangster. And I want to talk about the writing and publishing of Retail Gangster as well. But as I said, we're a podcast about finance and investing books, and this fits because it's a story about corporate and financial fraud. But the book's really rich. It really is more than just the story about Crazy Eddie. It's a family story. It's an immigrant story. It's a story about 70s New York City and the rise of again, discount retail, all kind of coming together. And it's also, I guess, the power of advertising, as we know. So what drew you to the story?
Well, I actually had never actually patronized a Crazy Eddie store.
Is that true?
No, I never did.
Okay.
I mean, I was sort of brought up, my father was an engineer, and he was very serious and when it came to buying electronic gear, and so he didn't like that kind of thing, and I was brought up not to patronize that kind of store. But okay. I got to know back in the early 2000s, actually. It's around 2007, 2008, I got to know Sam E. Antar, a fellow named Sam E. Antar, who was the chief financial officer of Crazy Eddie.
Right.
And I knew that Crazy Eddie was a fraud, but I didn't really know the story quite that well. And then I got to know him, and through him I got into the story. And that's really sort of how I became involved in writing this book.
And obviously it was well reported. You knew that part of it. What did you hope, or what did you learn that you thought was worth telling? What did you hope? What did you want to tell people about the story?
Well, I approached this book with some trepidation because it's a widely known story, and It's been written about not in many books, interestingly enough, but in articles. Many articles, some of them very big, entire chapters of books on financial fraud, documentaries, many documentaries, one after the other. Well, first thing I noticed was that some of these articles and some of the documentaries certainly were riddled with errors. But what the trepidation was from my concern that, I'm just going over an old territory. But then as I got into the story, I discovered a lot of details. Well, first, the details themselves are really kind of interesting. The people are interesting. Yeah. And there's just a lot of aspects of the story which have never become public. And I was just stunned by the number that there were out there.
Yeah. The book is really rich in detail, and I give you a lot of credit for the reporting that you did. How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, I started writing the book right in the middle of the epidemic. It's funny, we signed the contract within weeks of the pandemic blasting onto the scene. And then I would have to, all the plans I had of interviewing people in person, they just went up in smoke. So I would say it took Well, I started writing the book, I guess, around April or May of 2020, and then I finished up. Well, I was just doing the final touches earlier this year.
Okay.
There's certain aspects of the book, certain important details, which only came to my attention like in February of this year. So, greater part of 2 years, really.
So the book does center on the Antars, and again, I said this is an immigrant story. They were Syrian Jews who immigrated over, and Crazy Eddie was helmed by Eddie Antar, who's a son of Sam M. Antar. There are a couple Sams in there, so we have to differentiate. But it really struck me, and I didn't read your other book, but it struck me this was a story about a family, and it seemed like it was like a mob family. So did you find it, there were comparisons to your other book or writing about the mob? Did you find any parallels?
Well, the mob, my mob book, Born to Steal, was about a mob associate. It wasn't really, I didn't really get into the family dynamics, of the mafia, except that there were certain commonalities, when you're writing about organized crime and you're writing about white-collar crime, there are certain intersections,
Sure.
And then also one of the central characters, certainly the central character of Born to Steal was an informant, Lou Pizzuto, who was the central character in Born to Steal. And in Retail Gangster, Sam E., the accountant,
Yes.
this former chief financial officer, he was the whistleblower and informant. He became the whistleblower and informant. But the book is less about him than it is about the whole culture and the whole and about Eddie.
Yeah.
Eddie Antar.
Yeah.
The eponymous Eddie Antar.
Yes, and as people who know Crazy Eddie, and you have the picture here of Jerry Carroll.
Jerry Carroll.
And he was more associated, I think, with the face of Crazy Eddie than Eddie Antar, who tried to keep a more private persona. But you talk about the culture. Talk about the Syrian Jews, or in the book they call themselves the SY.
SY.
Yeah. Talk about how the culture coming over here kind of led them to this kind of, that you find out in the book that Sam M, they owned some small stores out in Brooklyn, and they gave one to Eddie to run. But what about the culture of the SY kind of helped this story, or helped kind of rise it to the to Eddie to kind of where he was?
Yeah, well, the SY community, the Syrian Jewish community, came over in the early part of the 20th century, and not too many people really know much about them. I mean, certain very well-known businesses were founded by the Syrian Jewish community. Republic Bank comes to mind. Edmund Safra, very well known. The Sassoon family is of Syrian descent, but it's a very insular community. It keeps to itself, and it's been centered in Brooklyn for many years. Originally, it was on the Lower East Side, and in one of the less sort of more shabby parts of the Jewish Lower East Side.
Yeah.
But the Syrian Jewish community was very certainly in the early part of the 20th century and in the early to mid-20th century, it was very mercantile oriented. It was all about stores, opening stores. All immigrant communities, certainly the Jewish community in general, was also very much into retail. I mean, one of my grandfathers was a shoemaker. He had a retail store. It was a big thing. But I would say the Syrian Jewish community was sort of more centered on not just establishing stores, as happened in the 20th century, but sort of handing them down from one to the next, and not assimilating quite the way the the Eastern European Jewish community did. So there was much less assimilation, and mainly because it was smaller, and they wanted to retain their distinctive cultural aspects, which they did, and have to this day. They tend to be very somewhat more orthodox. Right. And much more religious, and much more, and they've been very successful. It's something they take great pride in it, justifiably, of really retaining their distinct cultural aspects. Now, one of the side effects of having a very insular culture is that they did business in a certain way, and certainly in the 20th century, there was a tendency, because of the I would say the culture coming out of Ottoman Turkey and persecution. there was a tendency to not want to pay taxes. You know, you don't want to give the Sultan any more money than he demands, you know.
Right.
As I say, one of the only services the Sultan gave in Syria in the early 20th century was conscription and taxation. That was all they did. They took your young men and they taxed you. So one of the elements of the Syrian culture that Eddie adopted was, dealing in cash, skimming cash profits, and avoiding taxation. And this was part of what sort of launched him on his career, kind of.
Yeah, so it was an attribute, but he, again, as you learn, took things to the extreme. He kind of grew up, again, on Kings Highway in Brooklyn, and kind of learned, you say, from the clip joints here, learned some of these tactics. There was a term called, he would saffro customers, where he would rip them off and trick tourists in particular into paying $250 for a $25 camera.
Yeah, his early days were spent on Times Square.
Okay.
In Midtown Manhattan, or somewhere in the Times Square vicinity, in these little gift shops, which really specialized in ripping tourists off.
Yeah.
And then when he turned 21, his father set him up in a store on Kings Highway in the lower middle class section of Brooklyn, and that was a whole new environment for him. He'd have to deal with customers who weren't utter fools, coming in from the Midwest and so forth. So he had to learn how to make money, and the business that he was set up in was consumer electronics, which had real challenges for anybody. And then he figured out a way of being able to profit. He had his own way.
Yeah, this gets a little in the weeds, but so in these days, you had big brand names like Sony and other big names, and you couldn't really discount prices too much.
Yeah, that's right.
So but he was able to kind of get maneuvering around that, I guess, because you're skimming. You're not giving the government its money, so you could act like you could discount the prices a little bit more because you're making more because you're not giving the government its money.
Yeah. Well, what he would do is he would charge sales tax. That was one of the main ways he was able to compete with other small retailers. He would charge sales tax but not pass it on to the government. Now, in those days, like today, it was like 7%. So you've got a 7% built-in profit margin. And, the big electronic retailers would not sell to him, so he found alternate sources of supply.
Yes.
Which were very colorful, some of them. I mean, one was a numbers bank in the Bronx, which happened to operate a retail store. And gave him merchandise. And then he figured out ways of making money, maybe, dealing with the fact that he had only limited supply, dealing with the customers in his own sort of special way.
In his own special way, yes. So, you talk about price gouging. People know the term bait and switch, where you come in for one particular item and you leave with another. And there was a skimming. And then what is lunching?
Lunching. Well, that's one of the things he did, because he didn't have that much merchandise, So if a customer came in, wanted the Sony, which was advertised, well, he wasn't just going to send them away. If he would try to switch them to another product, you know, and most of the time they would do it. He'd say, look, take a Sharp. It's cheap. He would actually switch them to cheaper merchandise, but the cheaper merchandise gave him a bigger profit margin. You see, it's still bait and switch, by the way.
Right.
So let's say the customer insisted on a Sony. Okay, so what happened was they used to take returned merchandise and table models. You're not supposed to sell those to the customer unless you disclose, hey, this is a table model. It's been handled by 300 people.
You knew what you were getting into. Right.
Yeah, lunching was the technique they had of taking this table model. They'd say, hey, look, the customer who comes in might hear someone say, hey, I'm going to have lunch. What that meant was, they take a bag which looked like a lunch bag. They take out the specialized paraphernalia, the tape and so forth. They take the table model. They'd put it in a box which they'd set aside carefully. They'd use they put on the right kind of tape and the scissors, and so they made it look beautiful.
Right.
They look beautiful, and that was lunching. Lunching was the process of taking old merchandise and making it look new.
Right.
That was lunching. Okay.
So they did all these kind of tactics, these scams. They also engaged in a lot of insurance fraud. I love your description. If they would come in the morning and discover there was a leak They would take that as an advantage where they would come in, everyone would gather, and they put in merchandise that they couldn't return to the manufacturers, and then put it into the basement and then flood it more so that they can get more. More money.
Yeah. Well, they loved floods and they loved burglaries, or fires, burglaries. They loved any kind of incident because Eddie he always insured his merchandise for the retail price, best insurance. And then what happened if they had a flood, say, they'd truck in merchandise from stores. They'd truck in all the slow-moving merchandise from other stores, and they'd drop it off at the store where there was the flood and make sure everything got all wet and everything. And they put in a claim for the stuff that wasn't really, genuinely flooded.
Right.
And they called that spiking the claim. That was a thing. That's something they did throughout the history of Crazy Eddie. They didn't do everything throughout the history, but that was one of the things. It was a reliable moneymaker. They did that.
It was a dizzying amount of fraud, which you detail very well. But there were some things that also led to its success. And again, this was kind of the 70s New York, where people wanted good, they wanted good record players and good stereo equipment. It was, rock and roll was becoming big, so you had audiophiles come in wanting good equipment. So you had kind of a combination of things happening, but the advertising was a big thing as well.
Oh, yes.
And there's a gentleman who shares your last name, but not related, as you know.
Not related.
So a different Weiss, but he becomes a director of advertising, and he's the one who finds Jerry Carroll.
Yes.
So talk about how the advertising helped kind of the growth and the role of Jerry Carroll.
Well, Eddie had Eddie Antar. He had a real talent for hiring the right people. So he hired the right guy named Larry Weiss. There's no relation. This kid from the suburbs, as his advertising guy, and Larry recruited this guy Jerry Carroll, who was this fellow from Yonkers. He was a disc jockey at WPIX-FM, and he had just the right rhythm, and whatever. Eddie had already established that he was going to be, discounting was going to be his thing. He called himself Crazy Eddie. That was started out around 72, 73. They decided, that's going to be their shtick, the crazy merchant thing, which is as old as the hills.
Right.
They were going to. This was going to be their thing. So they hired Jerry Carroll to do TV commercials that were broadcast that saturated the airwaves. And this is the days before cable TV. They were like whatever 9 channels, and they were all over the channels in New York and throughout the tri-state area and. All night too, because they had only just started, broadcasting late night programming. They were all over the place, and it was like these very distinct commercials. Our prices are insane. I can't do justice to it. You find them on YouTube.
We'll have to try to mix one in. Yeah.
They're all over. Yeah. So that became really the signature for Crazy Eddie. This obnoxious guy in a turtleneck sweater.
And what's amazing is, and I don't know if. Today brands becoming, as popular, these things that, we're used now to standing outside in an Apple store for a new iPhone, but it really became like a cult kind of following that Crazy Eddie had, where people would come to the events. There would be lines, detail lines around the corner for like store openings. That was really kind of unique.
Yeah, they'd have a store opening. The store openings were events, big events. They'd have literally thousands of people there. I think 20,000 people or something. And people would line up just to see Jerry Carroll. He'd make a personal appearance. Eddie was very shy. He'd be off to the side. Right. And Jerry Carroll himself was shy. He didn't like to really meet people. But they'd be handing out these cheap T-shirts, and keychain, these little souvenirs. People would line up for these T-shirts.
Just to get a little merch.
It was phenomenal.
So we have a lot to cover. So I could I'd talk about all these little details, but again, all these things kind of led to the success. Crazy Eddie grows. And within a few years, they want to go public. They want to do an IPO. But with doing an IPO, as a lot of people know, you get a lot of scrutiny. They're going to look at your books, which we know there were 2 sets of, one for the government, one for themselves. But how were they able to fool the investment bankers and the lawyers and all these people who help you go public? How were they able to kind of because they were just kind of rife with fraud. It was really ingrained into the success of the company. So
Yeah.
how did they fool like all these people who wanted to take them public?
Well, Crazy Eddie CFO, the guy we mentioned earlier, Sam Antari, and he'd been in the company since he was a kid, and he was put through college by Eddie, and he figured out a way of juicing up the profits by reducing the amount of skim that was taken out every year in advance of the IPO, and it fabricated profit growth. So
it's the opposite. They put the money back they were skimming?
Well, no. They were taking out less and less money. They were skimming, but they were skimming less and less and less in the 3-4 years before the company went public. So it looked as if since they were skimming less, the profits looked more.
Got it.
Whoa, what's going on?
Right.
These are wonderful profits. So they made like a 3% profit increase into like 25, 40%. It was, but the professionals involved. Well, the accountants, they hired the very, very best law firm. They hired Paul Weiss, who went on, by the way, very recently. They became known as being the they became lawyers for Sam Bankman-Fried. Not there's anything to it's right. What you do. So Eddie did this to surround himself with to boost his prestige. Get prestigious law firms. The accountant firm, they had a top accounting firm, and they just simply did not look carefully enough at the books, and it's kind of like that's how they got away with it.
Yeah, and again, I think they were excited. Obviously, it was a popular brand.
It was in their interests for Eddie to succeed, so they're not going to look too closely and try to assume. Right. Besides, in those days, companies really weren't fraudulent.
Right.
You didn't have Enron, you didn't have Eddie.
Right.
You just didn't have the background that you now have.
Right.
But even if you did, I would say even today, it's the same incentive to want to accentuate the positive and not look too closely.
Yeah, you mentioned Paul Weiss and FTX, so a little bit of more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
But on that point, as they were doing the roadshow, as you get ready for IPO, you go out, you meet all these private investors who are going to help buy your stock. One of the big at the times, one of the things that dinged their IPO, their pre-IPO price, was an article in Barron's by Alan Abelson. So did you work with Abe at the time?
I was working in Barron's at the time. I think I had just joined the staff.
Okay.
So they had this article that actually was by one of Abelson's people. Everything was basically a product of Abelson's mindset. He assigned articles,
Very influential, right?
Pardon me?
Very influential.
Very influential, and he basically dictated what was in the magazine. But he had one of his people, Gigi Mann, one of his top writers, look through the prospectus, and the prospectus was... There was all this stuff that, she was focusing on the stuff that sort of didn't look good but was legal. She didn't know about the reduction in skimming, but there was a lot of stuff there that just didn't look so good.
Right.
That they had to disclose. All the interrelated family stuff. All the stuff that just simply didn't look so good.
Right. Right. So that dinged the stock, but it's still they were supposed to They had a pre-IPO price, $11, $13 was the range. This lowered it a little bit, but then it was oversubscribed. It went public in September 13th, 1984 at $8, and then went up. And again, it was a very popular stock. It had a number of splits. What was its height, the value? Do you remember?
Oh, I think it was something like $64 or something like that. The numbers in there. They had two splits. They split twice. The stock went through the ceiling, really. Yeah. Before collapsing. They were a real darling of the Wall Street. The analysts just fell in love with them. And partly it was because of Eddie's personal charm. He would deal with these analysts on a one-on-one basis, and he also had a very, very good PR guy. Named Ed Colleton.
Ed Colleton, right?
He was good. He
was a IR kind of specialist. Yeah. And got a lot of good articles placed for him. And in the book, he played a big part. But why did it was Eddie's charm? But they're analysts. They have to look at the company. Why did they love the company so much?
First of all, dealing with fake books.
Yeah.
He was fabricating profits, in the run up to the IPO and then after the IPO.
Right.
He would juice up the profits because once you begin a fraud, you kind of have to continue with the fraud. You can't just say, well, I'm going to do everything clean now. Well, that's not the way it works.
Yeah.
So you got to continue to do all kinds of frauds, which we can get into. It's going to take a long time. Look, inflating what was in the warehouses in order to juice up the profits. So look, Analysts, they don't know what's going on.
Right.
You know, they believe what they see in the financial statements. And it may seem too good to be true, but they say, hey, you know, look, this guy. And they called him the second Sam Walton. He was called at one point the second. Eddie was called the second Sam Walton, just as Sam Bankman-Fried has been called the second, the second Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, whenever you're dealing with seconds, you know,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
second Warren Buffett, the second whatever, you know, you always have to be very careful with that. You know?
Yeah, and they also were able, even to explain away, because Eddie obviously knew there was fraud going on, and you're allowed to sell stock as an insider. That doesn't mean you're selling on inside information, but we know he did. He sold multiple times.
Oh, yeah.
You have to disclose that.
He just sold and sold.
He
He
just-
dumped and dumped and dumped stock. It looked really bad. You know,
Right.
the
How did they
conventional wisdom is that, look, you know, when somebody buys stock, it's great. But if somebody sells stock, well, there could be any number of reasons. So it's just
Right.
baloney. But he was dumping and
Right.
dumping and dumping. And yet, the media, until the very, very end, didn't pick up on it. They said, oh, he's diversifying his portfolio, and people believed it.
Right. They kept using that
They
excuse.
kept using that ridiculous excuse.
Do you think that would work today?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I think
Some
the
version
media-
of it.
Oh, I think some version of it would, you know, again, all you have to do is just open up the papers today and look at all the puff pieces that's
Yeah.
around at FTX. I mean, look at all of that.
Yeah.
Look at all the look how Sam Bankman-Fried got his puss on all the
Yeah.
major financial publications.
Yeah.
So that's really all you have to do to figure. And, you know, that's turning out to be, I don't know if it's a fraud or not. It may turn out not to be, but it might turn out to be one of the biggest frauds since since Napoleon. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be.
Well, one thing that helped that you detail is there was the start of this bull run that really started around 82. And you can argue, yeah, we had some dips, but it continued until about 99, 2000.
Right.
And that certainly helps when there's so much froth in the market. And again, today you're seeing, again, a lot of things come home and roost. But in terms of corporate fraud, in terms of investigative journalist, is it harder to find these stories? Is it easier?
Well, look at it this way. You know, financial journalism is to a very large extent an access game.
Right.
And one of the problems that comes up when you're dealing with a very hot company like FTX, just to bring that up again,
Sure.
is that people, they want access to that company. And, you know, if they're not going to get access, if they're unduly skeptical.
Right.
And nowadays, you didn't have this years ago, but nowadays you have you have these conferences, you know, that these financial websites put on, financial journalism websites put on. And if you want, anyway, Bankman-Fried was going to be at a New York Times conference.
Right.
You know, he no longer is. But if you wanted to attend your conference, you know, you can't knock up in the press. And also you have to keep in mind a lot of financial journalists nowadays are very young, and they weren't around during Enron, and they're sort of swept up in the
Right.
in the glamour of these people, and you see that happening all the time.
Yeah. So I want to get back a little bit because there are, as you know, there are a lot of different frauds. We don't have time to get all of them. But can you explain to our audience what was the Panama pump?
The Panama pump. Well, that was one of the ways they kept the profits moving forward. After a while, Eddie he just couldn't compete against. Other stores started really eating his lunch.
Sure.
They started competing against them. So to boost comp store sales, the sales of stores that have been around for a while, they're usually tracked by analysts.
Right.
He just brought back in. He had a lot of cash in Israel, and he brought in the money from Israel through Panama and deposited into the individual accounts of the stores to elevate their comp store sales.
Got it.
That was the Panama pump. They pumped in cash. Very simple, although it just he brought it in through Panama because he thought if he did that, he'd evade detection.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was wrong.
Yeah. Well, one of the other tactics, because again, you're feeding the beast because they had on paper looked like all this great growth. You have to keep showing growth, right?
Yeah.
If the stock's going to keep going up. So it was always interesting around their earnings that they had to, raise it so they like they were continuing to grow. How do they use these blank checks to basically help show some of this growth?
Well, they use various ways to sort of to boost their profits. It was getting harder and harder because they were getting competition.
Right.
I mean, more and more mini imitation Crazy Eddies were popping up, so it was harder and harder. So they had an arrangement with one of their suppliers, actually several of their suppliers, where they would just simply write out checks, and the checks would be deposited on a certain date. The whole idea was just simply, like create paper
Right.
that can boost their profits.
Right.
In an artificial fashion, and they did that with checks. They did that with something called debit memos, which are basically they wrote up, the supplier owes us money. They owe us $20,000 for this and blah blah blah, and they'd send it to them, and the supplier would look at it. They say baloney and throw it in the garbage. But by writing that $20,000 debit memo, they increased their profits by $20,000, just like that.
Yeah, it's dizzying. It was basically a house of cards, and it does eventually unravel, as you know. And again, the analysts were all on board. They loved it. Yeah. They were even still drinking the Kool-Aid as things did start to unravel. Yeah. So finally, things start to get out. The house of cards starts to fall. In June '89, they file for Chapter 11.
Yeah.
And then they're ousted in the NASDAQ in October of '89. Mm-hmm. How many stores at their height did they have?
They had 43. Well, they had 43 after getting ahead of the story. By the time they had about 42 at the time they declared bankruptcy. But even after things started to go downhill, they added a store. The new owners added a store. We haven't gotten to the new owners
yet. Right, the new owners, yes.
Oh, yes. 43 at the height, yeah.
We talk about due diligence, and again, it's head scratching. Although like you said, we still have things like this happen. They had someone come in at the last minute. Who were these buyers that came in?
Oh yeah, two of the unluckiest individuals on the face of the earth. One was a big turnaround expert. An immense turnaround expert. The other was this little retailer from Texas. They joined forces, and they were just hoodwinked. They had never encountered anything like a company like this. They believed everything that was in the financial statements, and they just got taken to the cleaners. Yeah. Eddie wanted to be taken over. He wanted to be taken over because he wanted to get out of the company, and he wanted to be taken over by a takeover artist that he could fool and that would not be interested in actually doing the books.
Right.
But he didn't get his wish. He opened it up. They were in play, and they got taken over by guys who were just absolutely very upset when they learned what was going on.
Yeah, it was amazing because I guess they believed the books. They couldn't fathom there was this level of fraud, I guess.
Yep.
So they didn't do the due diligence. They thought it was just a problem company that they could rescue. Oh, would that be accurate?
Yeah, pretty much. They thought it would. Look, this is one of the guys there. One of the takeover guys. Elias Zinn was his name, from Texas. Young guy, got a lot of real puffy press when he was taking over. When he was taking over Crazy Eddie, and he actually said, it's like a wheel with one of the spokes missing. He was like, oh, they used to be great, but I can do a better job managing this company than they can. What an utter fool this guy was. But as I say, unlucky. He took over the wrong company.
Yeah. So eventually they close. They file. Then Chapter 11 converts to Chapter 7. They close. They close all the stores. And then the last third of the book is like and I think he's one of the endorsers, Frank Abagnale. It becomes like a catch me if you can, because Eddie goes on the run because he's charged. There's criminal charges. There's an SEC investigation, and at first, since this is a family business, no one's turning on each other. Even Sam E., who becomes the whistleblower, at first spends 5 days just lying straight to the SEC.
That's right. That's right.
What changed where he became the whistleblower?
Well, Eddie showed poor judgment in dealing with people. He hired good people, but the closer you got to him, the closer it was that he was going to stab you in the back. Yeah. That's kind of what happened with his chief accountant and cousin, Sammy Antar. Sammy Antar was racking up legal bills on behalf of the family.
Right.
Eddie wouldn't give him a nickel. Eddie had millions of dollars he ripped off in the company. Wouldn't give him a nickel. And meanwhile, a couple of guys looking out for themselves came forward and came forward to the feds and blew the whistle on the company and blew the whistle on Sammy, and Eddie. So he was a target of a federal investigation. He was being sued. His life was coming to an end. What are you going to do? So he came to the feds, and actually, initially, the feds didn't believe him.
Right.
They had their rats.
Right.
We don't need you. We have the true story. Go away, go away. It was just comical. They were the ones that everybody believed. In the federal government, the SEC believed them. The prosecutor believed them, and
right. Later on, so talk about, and this is interesting and brings up another issue. So Eddie since he's Jewish, he goes to Israel and gets Israeli citizenship, and he exploits that. And how is he found by the feds? Because that's a real interesting story.
Yeah, well, he thought that he was Israel is set up to escape people. Jewish people who were fleeing persecution, but he thought that he could escape prosecution, by going to Israel, and that sometimes it works,
right?
But it doesn't always work. Didn't work for Meyer Lansky. He had to go back. So he flees to Israel and he becomes a citizen legitimately. You can do that. Doesn't matter. Then he had an alias. He made his alias a citizen. Israel really didn't like it. They didn't like a non-existent person becoming a citizen of Israel. So when the federal government found out about him being in Israel, which they found out because of documentation that Eddie had sent to Switzerland for his money, he had put his real birth date on it.
Yeah.
But when they found out, the Israeli government, they wanted to get rid of this guy.
Right. It was making him look bad.
Yeah, and eventually they were able to kick him out. He agreed to return to the United States.
So he comes back and he's brought to trial finally. I think there were 17 charges is brought up along with what's funny is like after all the people, and again it was a family business and they were all involved in some way, but it was really the bulk of the charges fell to Eddie and then a few charges to a couple of his brothers. Yeah. And he is found guilty.
He was found guilty.
But what's interesting is on appeal, it's overturned amazingly. How does that happen?
Well, it doesn't happen that often.
Right.
It doesn't happen every day that, in a major headline case like this, that, the case is just completely thrown out and the judge is slapped by the appellate court, but they reversed because of some minor comment the judge made in one of the sentencing hearings that the appellate court, Third Circuit Court of Appeals said, oh, no, you were prejudiced.
Yeah.
So they threw it out there, but they replaced them with a judge who was tougher. The judge who was tossed out, a fellow named Nicholas Politan, was tossed out. They replaced him with Judge Harold M. Ackerman. Judge Harold Ackerman was a very tough judge. Yeah. So that didn't really make things better for Eddie. And Eddie and his brother Mitchell, his other brother Alan was acquitted, but Eddie and his brother they pled out. They pled guilty.
They pled out because I guess they saw the writing on the wall there.
On the wall.
Yeah. They got a little lucky, but then eventually they made a deal.
They both went to prison. Yeah.
So how much did Eddie have to pay?
Well, basically all the money in Israel. Eddie misunderstood the way the international banking system works. It's not like in the James Bond movies. They cooperate with the government, the U.S. government nowadays. So I think it was well over $100 million of Eddie's money that, these were proceeds from his sales of stock, from his stock dumps. Yeah. Basically, the government did a fairly good job of getting all that money. Yeah. But you never know, and there's always a possibility that he may have had a little money left over. Yeah. He was still finding cash.
Years later. Yeah. You read it, and it was an expansive investigation. They did recover a lot of the money.
Yeah. Good job.
We didn't get into too much, but Eddie had a bad reputation. You say, look, he was addicted to stealing from day one, and the Gateway was kind of ripping off those people from the beginning, and it never really changed. But there was also a rivalry because, again, to be in the Syrian community that we started talking about, to be the head of family was, if you had that, you were respected by everyone. And what really fueled Eddie in the end, do you think?
Well, it's always hard to say. You know, he's dead now, and I never
Yeah.
got a chance to talk to him. And what fuel? And if I did talk to him, he would have lied to me. He was a Confederate liar. You know, he was just. It's just the old-fashioned greed. You know, and you know that he was greedy because he wouldn't part with a nickel even to his cousin, and when it was in his interest to give money to his cousin, and he cheated everyone in sight. He cheated his wife, his first wife.
Right. Which is another
she sued
part
and
of the
sued.
story.
His litigation with his ex-wife, I believe, was still underway in 2019.
Yeah.
After he'd been dead for 3 years.
Yeah, he died in 2016. He told her they were divorced, or he told her he'd got her forged. I think there was a forged signature involved. Told her, "I'll get you. You're going to get so much money. You're going to get all this." And they were already divorced, and she didn't even know.
Yeah, I mean, his ex-wife was somewhat naive and trusting person, and she believed him. You know, he had this aura, he had this magnetism that attracted people, not just members of his family, but also employees to this day.
Yeah.
Employees just idolize this man. Now, that's not true about anybody else in his life. Could you say that about Madoff? Can you say that about all these other bums from Enron and so forth? Can you say it about Bankman-Fried?
Right.
No.
Well, that's what was surprising. And again, he's such a private persona. You don't really ever. A lot of people really didn't know him. But you talk about how even his cousin years later they had they met. I think it was like on CNBC. They had this hours-long meeting in a hotel. Not all of it aired, but it was kind of they confronted each other a little bit. But his cousin even says he loved him. He looked up to him. I can't see the charm, obviously, that people saw, but it was there, right? People loved it.
There. Yeah, I don't see it either, but it was there.
It was there,
and you just simply have to look at what people say about him to this day, and in social media, and you have to just see the loyalty toward the man. Go to his grave. He's buried out in Staten Island. It's covered with stones, sort of like Schindler's grave. People visit his grave out of respect, and they you put stones on the grave, which is what you do when you visit a Jewish grave. And it's covered with stones. He's still there. People love and admire him to this day. Even people who were ripped off by him. Yeah. Some of his associates.
That's amazing. Anyway, it's a great story. I encourage everyone to read it. It's Retail Gangster. So I do want to talk a little bit about, this is your fourth book.
Yes.
Your first book we mentioned was published almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So talk about your writing process. First of all, it's so well researched and reported. It said it took you a couple years, but did you do all the research and reporting on it? How did I know obviously Sam, you reached out to him, you did a lot of interviews with him. Yeah. So that probably helped fill in some of the blanks. Sure. But talk about the writing process of this book. Well,
if you look in the book is footnoted. Endnotes are very lengthy. Everything is sourced. Well, in the endnotes, you notice some of the interviews I conducted as early as 2007. This is just when I was thinking about doing the book. I sat down at Sammy, and I had a tape recorder, and we talked for a long time. I mean, it was sort of an interview process, which began even when I just was considering. I mean, that's the first thing you do when you want to write a book, is you'd talk to people, you take their story, sort of like a policeman. Take your story. It's like, you don't get a stenographer, you have a tape recorder. Right. So I just took down his story, and then so I wound up having, I forget how many hours of interviews I had with him and other people, hundreds of hours. And to a large extent, though, it was really a question of documentation, because so many of the people involved are either dead or they wouldn't cooperate. Right. But I had depositions, and for example, his first wife would not talk to me. Yeah. But I had her depositions, which she gave. These are sworn statements that she gave to the court just in the early 1980s. So I had that. There's just a lot of documentation. I can see there's a lot of detail to it. So talk about, how'd you shop it? Through an agent? What was the process? And did you have was it an easy sell for your agent? Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask my agent. I'm not involved in that. It's like my agent. That's the way it is with me. But compared to your first or your subsequent books? I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say whether, a book is more or less saleable than the next. As I say, I'm not the one who does the selling. My agent does the selling, with the Janklow Nesbitt agency, which is one of the top agencies. So they do. I don't want to say whether something is easy or hard to sell. That I
Okay.
reflect upon my agent, who is one of the best. And I must
Well, he got
add-
it sold.
Well, I want to tell you, my agent Richard Morris is
Yeah.
the hardest work. I will say it about him. He is the hardest working agent
Yeah.
in the business. That much I will say.
Yeah.
I'm very blessed to have Mr. Morris.
Great. So, just in terms of your other books,
Yeah.
how do, just looking at publishing and the process and what you've went through with this book compared to those other books, do you see a difference in terms of, how books are promoted and what you've had to do?
Well, the book business has changed completely
Yeah.
since my very first book. The very first book was written, I wrote that book in 2000 or so, and it was published in 2003. I remember I submitted the manuscript in 2001. It was published in May of 2003. The lag time was longer.
Yeah.
Here was a little bit more abbreviated. The book business has changed. Now you have the internet, now you have podcasts and so forth.
Right.
The podcast did not exist when I did my first book. I just did a lot of radio interviews.
Right.
Certainly selling books was differently. Amazon was not as important. Amazon was important, but it wasn't as important as it is today. Online. So everything, the whole book industry is changing. And of course, people are reading less than they used to.
Right.
So, it's harder to...
Attention spans are getting a little
Attention
shorter.
spans, it's a little bit harder to get a book out there before the public.
Yeah.
I will say.
Well, it's a great investigative book. We keep talking about corporate frauds.
Yeah.
Just going back, how, obviously, numbers-wise, the numbers might not blow people away, but this was, the 80s, it was 120 million or so.
Yeah.
How do you think it compared since it was before the days of Enron and, WorldCom and, these other big corporate blow-ups?
Well, I'll tell you, this is self-serving, I know on my
That's
part.
all right.
This is self-serving. But to me, the major thing, the thing that sets apart the Crazy Eddie story from the other stories is just the richness of the human accounts. In other words, I chose to do the story through the people. Now, if I were to write about Enron through the people, I'd be dealing with some very dull people down in Texas, real white bread individuals down in Texas. Now, mind you, some of them are despicable individuals. I mean, Madoff is one of the most despicable people to walk the planet Earth. But he had no charm. He had no color. Nobody liked him. Everybody hates the man. I don't even know if he's even buried. Did he buried beneath the floor of a prison or something? I mean, the man, nobody liked Madoff. Nobody liked Kozlowski. Nobody liked any of these other clowns.
Yeah.
It's just a question of the human characteristics of the people. You can have people who are interesting.
Yeah.
They can be the worst people in the world. But a Charles Manson is more interesting than I don't know, than a Carlo Gambino, probably.
Yeah.
It's just, what are and the thing that I really liked about working on Crazy Eddie is just, there was just so many intriguing and interesting characters.
Yeah.
For instance, I was surprised to find, of course, one of my interests is organized crime, and I was surprised to find there were two mafia stories.
Right.
They're just sort of intertwined with Crazy Eddie, just completely independent of each other.
Right.
Not one, but two mafia stories. One of the guys who used to work in the stores became the acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, and it's just by coincidence.
I know. There are a lot of those moments in the book.
There's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
like that.
A couple of things I just remember, and we do still have some time.
Yeah.
The fact that James Brown offered to be the voice of Crazy Eddie early on.
James Brown wanted to be the spokesman for Crazy Eddie.
He offered. Why?
He just liked Crazy Eddie. Crazy Eddie was big back in the 80s, and James Brown needed the work. So James Brown, you have all these cameos in this book. James Brown. You have individuals just coming in and making brief appearances and exiting.
Yeah, it's very cinematic in that way, like just these great cameos. It's a little sad, we the book on the cover again is Jerry Carroll, and then you read that he died. There was no big funeral. There was, I think at the time, there was not even a notice in the New York Times or any papers.
Yeah,
he died in a real obscurity, in contrast to his ads.
Well, Jerry Carroll, I was amazed to find that Jerry Carroll had died. There was no record of his death. There was no obituary. There was nothing. And not only that, but nobody knew about it.
Yeah.
Sammy Antar didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Certainly Larry Weiss. All the people I was interviewing didn't know about it. One person did. Yeah. He was kind enough to tell me. Right. So I spoke to Mrs. Carroll, who said, Yeah, I said, well, I hope he's doing, I said, look, I hope everything is okay with Jerry. Oh, no, he's dead. He's dead? Oh, yes, he's been dead for 2 years. I said, oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
It hadn't appeared anywhere.
When did he die?
Well, he died in the fall of 2020 of a long-standing heart ailment, and he just was a quiet man.
Yeah.
He didn't want any publicity. So it's like I say, the man who screamed his way
Right.
into the public consciousness, he left the earth in silence.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Gary Weiss, that's your time on Readable. Again, the name of the book is Retail Gangster. It's an amazing book. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much for talking to me. Appreciate it.